Good afternoon and welcome to today's conversation on the history and current landscape of the American theater. My name is Seema Sueko. I work as a theater artist in the United States, and I'm so pleased to be here with two of my theater colleagues in the US, theater and performance historian Esther Kim Lee and Curt Columbus, artistic director of Trinity Rep. Thank you, Esther and Curt, for sharing your time with us. I'm pasting in the chat window our respective websites, so you'll be able to read a little bit about the background of our speakers today. I'm so pleased to welcome among our audience students and faculty here today from Moscow State Linguistic University. And I'd like to give a special thank you to Professor Alexander Petrov for bringing us all together. This event is produced by the Forum for Cultural Engagement and the American Center in Moscow in coordination with the U.S. Embassy Moscow. As we begin our conversation, I'd like to invite our audience to use the chat function at any time during this event to type your questions to the speakers. So let's begin with a very big question for which I'm asking just a simple answer from both Curt and Esther, and that is, how do you define theater? And I wonder if you each could respond with just one sentence. Curt, may I ask you, how do you define theater?
One sentence, wow. I define theater as a story which is told by at least one person, live, and in the same room with at least one other person who is the auditor of that story. It must be live. It must be spoken in the same room with the same breath, where our heartbeats can sync up together.
Excellent. Thank you, Curt. And Esther, how do you define theater?
Yes, thank you. I've thought about this for a while, but I do have one sentence. I made it into a shorter, I think, than Curt's sentence. I define theater as an unmediated communal ritual we participate in to watch a story told before our eyes and to experience life more deeply and collectively.
Excellent. You both pass with one sentence responses. Thank you so very much. So let's dive a little into the past. And Esther, could you talk a little bit about the history of theater in the United States?
Yes, so history of theater in the United States really reflects the history of the US in general. And when we think of American theater, we may think of Broadway, for example, but that's just one aspect. That's very New York, East Coast centric theater history. So the way I look at American theater, I could mention four major trajectories. So first, we can begin with Native American performance traditions as the oldest form of theater in the US. Rituals, oral traditions, dances have existed for centuries, long before Europeans first came to this continent. And some of those traditions still continue to this day. And the second trajectory I would mention is the European colonists. And when they came, they also brought traditions of theater with them. So the first documented European play to have been performed in North America was in fact in Spanish. And it was in the 16th century. To be precise, it was in Florida in 1567. We can view American theater since the 16th century as European colonial theater. So that's another way to look at American theater. And thirdly, American theater consists of theatrical and performance traditions of those who came to this country, either voluntarily or involuntarily. So this trajectory would include African-American theater and many types of immigrant theaters. But what we currently recognize as American theater, say in terms of Broadway, for example, is really of British theater tradition. And I would say that this trajectory has been the most dominant form of theater since the 19th century. And it is this tradition that gives us the content and the forms that we are currently using to understand contemporary American theater.
Thank you, Esther. So what I heard you say is four sort of traditions in American theater in the United States: Native American, European colonial theater, immigrant African-American, and British. Did I get that correct, or were there other things I missed there?
No, those are the four major. I think that would be inclusive. Yes.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, well, let's forward a little bit and talk about the theater today, the current landscape of American theater. Curt, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about this. How is theater produced in the United States today, and how does that differ from how it is produced in Russia? I know you've spent a great amount of time in Russia, working with Russian artists, and so could you illuminate a little bit of that?
Sure. When we talk about theater in the United States today, as Esther mentioned, if there is not a single tradition, theater today in America is not a monolith either. So in other words, we have Broadway theater, which I think is known internationally. We also have what is called the regional theater movement in America. I'm part of that movement. Those are theaters that have grown up in communities around the country. They are very specifically designed to be performed in those communities. That movement started in the 1950s in America. And then as a response, both to the Broadway theater and to the regional theater movement, what happened is that you had what is often called the storefront movement. That's the response to the more traditional forms that predominated in that Broadway and regional theater movement. I want to highlight something that Esther said. The British traditions that came to this country in the 19th century, around the mid-19th century, have really predominated up until here, the beginning of the 21st century. And so what you have seen is a kind of monolithic aesthetic approach, which is based in that late 19th century British naturalism. It coincides with the kind of Stanislavskian naturalism. And so there's not a lot of aesthetic diversity that has been a part of the American theater movement from the 1950s until the early 2000s. And we can talk about that a little bit later on. I had the great good fortune in the late 1980s to be invited to Russia and spend time both in Moscow. I actually lived in Leningrad and studied at Leningrad State University. So I've had a lot of encounter with Russian theater artists, but I'd say that I'm fairly unique in that among American theater artists. And so that's what I would say at this point, Seema.
How does, as you describe this, the different types of ways that theater is produced, how does that differ from how it's produced in Russia based on what your experience has been there?
Thank you. I'm sorry, I forgot that particular question. So one of the things that folks should know, American theater is very driven by the commercial aspect because government funding for the arts in this country has been non-existent. My theater, Trinity Repertory Company, and most of the theaters like my theater get less than 1% of their annual budget from any government sources, any and all government sources. That means that 99% of our budget comes from donations, ticket sales, and other sales. So the main driver of American theater is quite different from the European theaters. I mean, when I first lived in Russia, Russian theater was basically state-sponsored up to about 85–90%. I believe that in the last 20 years, Russian theaters are funded between 35 and 65%. I may be wrong about that, but in any event, there's a much greater government funding, and so the programmatic choices are driven by different forces than here in America than they are, say, in a country like Russia or a country like France, a country like Germany. So.
That's great. Thank you, Curt. Esther, I wonder if I could turn to you and if you could continue to speak about the current landscape of American theater in terms of what does that mean in terms of content or form? What are we seeing in American theater today?
Sure. So going off on what Curt said about naturalism and the dominance of British theater, and the idea of what an actor should be, and this goes back to Stanislavski partly, but when naturalism does not mean what is natural for everybody. That was a particular idea of what naturalism meant, which is the kind of default human. And that often was the kind of white male and often Anglo-Saxon white male. And so this meant that anyone who did not could kind of pass as one of them were marked, say, racially or in terms of gender or ethnically. So American theater has been an effort to use that so-called neutral body to tell stories. And what's happening currently is we're questioning whether that is actually the way we should think about acting. And if you look at Hollywood history, early 1930s, for example, we have immigrants from, say, Jews from Russia and becoming white, right? So it was completely kind of made up category, but then they would bleach their hair blonde, put contact lenses on and blue eyes to kind of have this idea of Anglo-Saxon whiteness. But so that was what was kind of celebrated as the kind of the ideal actor, the body that we could kind of funnel and channel these stories. But now we're questioning that. So one really great example of this, say, the musical Hamilton. So Hamilton is a quintessential American story, the foundation of this country, the founding fathers, but that story is told through so-called brown bodies or non-white bodies. So when you look at the casting call, there's kind of a priority given on the category of non-white. So the casting director got in trouble for this. Is it violating this kind of equity rules and all this stuff? But that is what's happening. Can we use this kind of, or can we expand the idea of the default actor? So going along with this, it really translates to how we think about the theatrical form. So no longer are we looking at, say, a stage and say, oh, that could be somebody's living room, a real living room. We're not thinking like that. We're thinking about, okay, how was this constructed? Who is actually defining the space socially, culturally, privately? And we're looking at the kind of the artifice of theater. So I see a lot of meta theatricality, a lot of kind of questioning of the stage itself. So like Young Jin Lee's Straight White Men, for example, that play is about straight white men. You see that on stage, it's really naturalistic. But what she does is she frames it literally with like this art painting frame. And she has or non-binary, and as well as kind of those who are not white male, these characters living outside, and the story is really about them. That's the framing of it. So the emphasis on how the theater form and the content is constructed and paying attention to the kind of effort to make that staged. And it's really an extension of this kind of Brechtian idea of the alienation. But I think we're going one step further. So that those questions are being asked in really interesting ways. So that's the trend I'm following. And that I'm really finding as a kind of a new development in American theater.
That's great, Esther. How new would you say this development is?
This is not necessarily new. I mean, I study Asian American theater, which is considered minority theater. It's a movement that began in the 1960s. If you look at African American theater, it began in the Harlem Renaissance in 1920s, 30s. So, it's really a 20th century history, but those theaters have always been marginalized. They've always been considered outside of the so-called mainstream theater. But what we're seeing, I think I would say kind of 21st century, maybe even the 1990s, really a multicultural movement, so-called the cultural wars, right, of America. That's when we start to see this kind of pushing into the mainstream. And I'm really curious to see what's going to happen post-pandemic, because there are many artists who are really excited about how we can see the margins changing the center, or are we just kind of seeing another kind of iteration of kind of having hope but then going back to the so-called default. So it's definitely a late 20th century, early 20th century movement that's still in progress.
Great. I do see that one question came through, and while I'm still speaking with you, Esther, and on this topic, I'd be curious. The question is, I wonder if you could name one of your favorite plays and why.
Oh, one of my favorite plays. Again, I specialize in Asian American theater, and the play that I teach, I've taught it probably dozens of times, but every time I read it, I discover a new thing is David Henry Hwang's And Butterfly. That play won the Tony Award 1988, so it's an older play. But it's a play that has so many layers, and just speaking of playing with form and content, it's a very meta theatrical play, and it really talks about the powers between the East and West and how that plays out in personal lives. So I would say that would be always close to my heart.
Thank you, Esther. So continuing this conversation about sort of the who of American theater, Curt, there was a movement that started last summer in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, who was a Black man who was murdered by police in Minneapolis. And in our theater field, there was a movement called We See You, White American Theater, which came out with a list of demands for American theaters, American universities that are teaching theaters, and the unions as well. Could you talk a little bit about We See You, White American Theater and the impact it is or is not having as you see it where you are?
Yeah, it's having a great impact. I mean, I want to go back to what Esther was saying about the neutral body and redefining the neutral body in the American theater, because I think that's actually where all of this movement began. And there's a really good practical demographic reason to redefine the neutral body, and that is the changing demographic nature of the United States, right? So we know from the demography of the last 20 years that by 2050, the United States of America will be a majority non-white country. So that simple fact is part of why this movement is so incredibly powerful right now. Theaters must change and adapt to welcome new audiences if they're going to remain relevant and commercially viable, honestly, right? If that's a part of the foundational structure of the way theaters operate, then speaking to a new audience is imperative for the survival of the form and the institutions as they exist. So We See You, White American Theater and the demands, which I like to characterize as a love letter to the American theater. It was a group of BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color artists who put together a list of things that needed to change in the American theater for the American theater to evolve, to adapt, to welcome new audiences and new artists into the institutions. So I encourage folks to look at the We See You, White American Theater document. It's available online. And that document has been driving a lot of the conversations that are happening at the regional theater level around the country. So in my institution, it has been driving conversations that we're having at the trustee level, which is the group of folks who oversee the entire institution. It's happening at the staff level. It's happening at the artist level. It's happening at the student level. So it's actually a shaping document for the next phase of the American theater. If I can be a little bit selfish, Seema, and answer the question about my current favorite play.
I would love that, please.
The one that I would lift up for folks to know is Jackie Sibley's Drury's Fairview. It's aesthetically part of the tradition that Esther is talking about because it challenges the form of who is watching, what is being watched. It uses the frame of a traditional play, but then in the second act, it's a traditional play with an entirely African-American cast. In the second act, you watch that play being played again, but now you only hear the white theatergoers who are watching that play. And then at the end, the third act, the two worlds collide, and I won't say any more than that. But it's one of my favorite plays for the reason that it asks all of the questions that are currently part of the conversation that we're having.
That's great. Thank you, Curt. Esther, I'm wondering if there's anything else you'd like to add around We See You White American Theater and or the conversations you're hearing at the university today.
Yes, I think what I can add is how theater is situated in American culture in the context of the dominance of mediated dramatic storytelling, namely Hollywood, Netflix, etc. I mean, I think that's how America is kind of made legible, right? These kind of huge corporations that churn out countless numbers of mediated storytelling, acted and excellent content. And in a way, if you look at that and someone say, okay, what is the purpose of theater? Like, why do we need theater when these other industries are doing such a great job? But what is lost in the conversation is how much theater is contributing to that. So namely, I think I would say name any major playwright, they're probably writing for TV right now. So a lot of playwrights go into TV writing, and not only just in terms of kind of diversity of the voices that we've been talking about, but in terms of genre. So I would mention, say, for example, a Vietnamese American playwright, Quy Nguyen. And he is known for, some of you may have seen, students may have seen this kind of latest Disney animation called Raya. And it's been celebrated as like, really cool, it's a great kind of way to tell stories about Southeast Asian culture. But Quy began as a playwright in 2000 when he co-founded a theater company called Vampires and Cowboys. And that is a kind of self-described geek theater. So if you're into like comic books or action movies, Marvel, Comic-Con, those things, that's for you. But instead of making, say, like Captain America, the white male hero, what that company did was really, make women heroes, make people who are like, queer heroes. So there's an effort to kind of tell different kinds of hero stories. But I use that example because he's not only, I could categorize him as an Asian American playwright, but he's also writing this kind of so-called geek theater, which is very different kind of genre that we had not seen before, as well as he's really kind of entered, Hollywood and Netflix world and Disney world, and he's changing that world too. So there's really a lot of kind of, kind of travels and permeation, like permeating kind of this kinds of, collaborations that we are seeing. And I think theater has to be part of that. Theater cannot be so-called purists and say we're not going to do anything that is not mediated. We can't. We just cannot survive in that world. So I think especially with the pandemic, I've seen a lot of Zoom play readings, for example, and I think that's a good thing. I think this is a kind of a process of adapting to this new world that we're in, and I think I'd be really kind of curious to see how this really translates when we actually go back to live theater.
That's great. So it sounds like American theater is actually going through a lot of change and push and pull, and I imagine a lot of tension and collapse. What does this mean in terms of audience? The American theater audience, I understand, is already just a small percentage of Americans in general. And so what does that mean? Who is actually watching theater? Curt, could I turn to you for that?
Sure. Yeah, I love, Seema, that you use the word collapse, because I think that's actually part of what we've been watching for the last 30 years in the American theater, is a collapse of the traditional audience base. And there's been a lot of hand-wringing in the American theater around the notion of the subscription model, right? We've had a model in this country where people bought whole seasons of plays, right? They subscribed to the season, and that was how theaters made the bulk of their money. Nationally, we've seen a drop off in that model by about 30%. Now, the interesting thing for us at Trinity Repertory Company is, because we have been focused on stories by writers of color for the last 3 seasons, we've had those stories be the predominant stories. What we've seen is a growth in audience, actually, and ticket buying audience and subscription audience. by about 40%. And we've also seen a growth in our audience under the age of 40 by 40%, and in a growth in our audiences of color by 40%. So I don't think that's accidental or incidental. I think the collapse of the American theater is the collapse. It all ties back to Esther's incredible point around who is the neutral body on our stages. And I think that as we see the collapse of that neutral body being the white European and Northern European male, we're going to see an evolution in the audience that comes to the theater. We're already seeing it.
That's great. So what I'm hearing you say is, in diversifying your programming, the whose stories are told, who is on stage, that is subsequently impacting the who is coming to the theater as well.
That's right. And in fact, if we are to remain relevant, I mean, Esther's been talking about Netflix, and that target audience is a younger, more diverse target audience for those stories, and we're seeing those stories diversify in terms of the bodies that are central in them. The theater has to understand the ways in which it must also adapt in order to attract that audience as well.
That's great. And Esther, around this question, what are you hearing university students saying at this time, those who are choosing to study theater? Why are they studying theater? What are the conversations that they're excited about?
Yeah, sure. So the point that Curt made earlier, where the US will become majority non-white by 2050, if you look at the number below 18 years old, it's already the case. The population under 18 is already majority non-white. Okay, so that's the kind of demographic that I'm already seeing on college campuses. And so my students are very interested in telling stories that are about, like, of course, kind of the perennial question of who am I, why am I here? Those kinds of identity questions. But at the same time, they're really interested in these larger global topics. So say climate change or neoliberalism or different kinds of ways that this kind of world is changing right now. So there's kind of genuine interest in tackling these larger issues, but they want to also do it with their voice. So they want to tell their own stories. So our playwriting classes fill up right away. There's quite a bit of interest in doing kind of self-produced work. So ironically, we actually have more theater groups and clubs than theater majors. People, would actually do theater. They love to do theater, not necessarily major in them, not necessarily become professionals, but they still want to use theater to tell their own stories. And I think this is really a good sign for, I think, theater going forward. And this is one thing that we are trying to implement on our campus, which is the theater departments in the US have always kind of been like mini regional theaters. We will kind of like bring whatever was on Broadway or off Broadway and then like produce it and see if students can kind of copy or imitate the professionals. But I think a lot of theater departments are rethinking that. We don't have to be mini regional theater. We don't have to be like copying Broadway all the time. But how do we then create our own work? Like going back to Hamilton, Lin-Manuel Miranda actually created a version of his works when he was in college at Wesleyan. So those are kinds of things that we think could be replicated, that we can really use universities to tell these original stories that can comment on these larger issues.
That's great. I have a question for our audience that I'd love people to maybe respond to in the chat window as you can, which is, I'm curious, among our audience, how many of you attend the theater in Russia regularly or occasionally? I'd be curious about that. And while folks are answering that, Curt, as we said earlier, you have spent a great amount of time in Russia. You have translated Russian playwrights to English. Could you talk about the perception of Russian theater in the US, and or what's also attracted you to spend so much of your time of your career in Russia?
Well, to answer the first question, Seema, rather importantly, I'll say that American theater artists and audience are very inwardly focused. I would contend that they don't know much, if anything, about Russian theater, and certainly not about contemporary Russian theater. If they think of Russian theater, they think of Chekhov, who is the second most produced playwright after Shakespeare on American English-speaking stages, right? So there's a lot of Chekhov, but there's not a lot of Chekhov in the way that Russian interpreters do Chekhov. So I'd say that we have a very narrow and extremely antiquated vision of what Russian theater is. It's interesting. I started studying the Russian language and fell in love with the Russian language, which was my way in to Russian theater. The two things sort of grew up together. I was interested in theater from the time I was a child, and then I became interested in the Russian language. I lived in Leningrad and spent time watching. I don't know if the young folks in our audience know who Slava Polunin is, but Polunin had a company in Leningrad at the time. It was called Litadei. And he's now known for something on Broadway called Slava's Snow Show. So that's how he's evolved as an artist. He's been involved with Cirque du Soleil. But I remember seeing Litadei in a basement youth center with 35 other people. And they were these remarkable physical performers. And it really transformed me as a young artist. So there are these, there's a great aesthetic diversity in Russian theater that I've seen. And it's actually greater than the aesthetic diversity that we have here in the United States. Far more challenging, far more diverse. And certainly in the mainstream theater. Yeah.
That's great. So what I'm hearing you say, because I love this, I want to understand further the contrast in theater in both Russia and the US. So when we talk about diversity in theater in the US, we tend to be talking about the body, right? The who.
The bodies and the stories.
And the stories. But what I'm hearing you say, your experience in Russian theater has been a diversity in terms of aesthetic. Do you mind elaborating further, since I'm seeing that some of our viewers have not been to the theater for some time. So what were you seeing in Russian theater?
Golly, I think what I was seeing was storytelling that occurred in very physical ways. There were interpreters like Svetlana Vragova, who was a director from Russia in the 1980s and 90s, who used to do what she would call rock and roll storytelling. There would be, the play would be going on, and then all of a sudden there would be a collision where suddenly music and violence and physical storytelling took over, and then we would go back into a story. So there were interpreters like that. Lev Dodin is the most famous example, whose work has been seen in the United States and all over the world. And Dodin has, done incredible things where whole plays have taken place on giant logs that are going back and forth across the stage. Mark Zakharov. I mean, there are these interpreters that challenge what is known as the form that you don't have in American theater today.
Thank you. Thanks, Curt. There's some great comments in the chat as well that I'd love to draw everyone's attention to. And Esther, I wonder if I could ask you to also elaborate on that with regards to international theater in the US and what you are seeing.
Yes, international theater, as Curt mentioned, is rare in the US. Translated plays are rare, bilingual plays are rare. And it really goes back to what Curt said earlier, which is that US theater is inherently commercial. It has to depend on ticket sales and box office. It doesn't have the kind of subsidy that many European countries and also Russia, it sounds like, have in being able to experiment and play and be able to fail. There's such a fear of losing money that theater in the US really has to be really conservative in terms of style. This is why we see musical versions of Little Mermaid, Aladdin, right? Those ones that people think will make money, and it's just not going to fail because we always will have tourists in New York City. So I think that is something that I don't know how to fix that, whether that would be possible to create something without having this kind of accountability, with budget and money. That may happen at universities. I mean, that's one thing that I think could be possible because students can create new things and fail. But there's a university support, right? But I think we need to find more spaces, more venues like that, in which we can tell these different stories and create new things. I mean, that's what art is about, right? It's about creating things we had not seen before. And that is, I'll be really interested in exploring with others beyond the university, like what other spaces are there where it's a real a playground where we could just do things, yeah.
That's great. So I'm hearing you say that there is a potential opportunity for American theater to maybe grow, mature, diversify aesthetically through universities, and maybe even for cultural exchange. And I guess I want to sort of see if we can build even further on that idea. What other opportunities are there out there for American theater to grow and mature, or opportunities for cultural exchange that you may be aware of, or interesting companies you've heard of? Curt?
Well, Seema, I'm looking in the chat and I'm seeing something that makes me a little heartsick, which is that a lot of the students are not seeing a lot of theater. One of the things, now I haven't been to Russia since 2012. One of the things that is, that what used to be a hallmark of Russian theater is that you always saw lots of young people in the audience because the price barriers to entry were not so great. What I'm seeing in the chat is there are lots of price barriers to entry, which didn't used to exist in Russian theater. So that's really horrible. I think to answer your question, one of the opportunities that's arisen over the last 30 years in America is that we've had a lot more focus on student discount, student access, trying to get audiences, younger audiences, hooked on theater. That's a huge opportunity to me. Anything that where you can focus young people's attention, there's a growth opportunity. And as Esther's saying, at the university level, there's a lot of self exploration. I know lots of universities where students are creating the main bulk of the theater. And that seems to me to be a huge opportunity. All of those voices are going to enter the theatrical mainstream and eventually be the Lin-Manuel Mirandas of the future. So the opportunities always lie with young people.
Oh, that's great. And thanks for drawing our attention to the robust conversation in the chat. And thank you to our audience for putting in these comments. It's illuminating. I'm looking at Dima Berkovich's comment, and forgive me if I've mispronounced your name. Dima writes, art these days is one way or another influenced by politics and current trends, but sometimes things turn out to be highly controversial. For example, when we talk about a historical theater play, should everything fit a particular time and setting, and is a denial to a person of color to act in that play if he or she doesn't fit historically, even though he or she is better in terms of acting a particular race, or there can be some conditionalities. I think this is actually the same conversation we're having in the US. I see you nodding. Curt, do you want to elaborate?
No, it's just that's exactly right. You know, I was taught, when I was thinking about what is theater, theater has to be a response to the current moment, right? Because as Esther said in her description of theater, it's about the communal experience and about changing communities, frankly. Film and television are commercial impulses. Netflix is a commercial impulse. Theater needs to be a community impulse. And that's where I find the Broadway theater really limiting and uninteresting. And I have no intention of being a part of it, because I'm interested in making conversations happen, like the one that Dima's talking about, where we can see bodies that were not historically in a particular story, and then have a conversation about why they're present now, right? So it's all about the community response, not about the preciousness of the art form. And I think that's really the future of the American theater.
I really love that and appreciate that, Curt. I encourage our audience to please feel free to put in any questions you might have for Curt or Esther in the chat. I do see, again, forgive me if I mispronounce your name, Polina Sadikova? Polina Sadikova. I see this comment. I love going to the theater, but last time I was there was 2020 spring, before the lockdown. The pandemic interfered with my visits to the theater, and that's sad. Well, yes. So in this last year, the theater, our buildings have been shut down. Yet artists have still been creating, but in a diversity of ways. I wonder, Esther and Curt, if I could ask you, in this year of lockdown and no theater in buildings, have you seen anything interesting in terms of theater being done that you could share with our audience? Esther?
Sure. I've seen many Zoom theaters, and I would say one that really touched me the most. This is really showing favoritism, but my students, they put a play together on Zoom, and they were literally all over the country. And the way they pulled it off, it was just so moving, and they didn't have to do it. It wasn't for a class. They just wanted to do it. They just wanted to connect. And it was stage reading, so it wasn't fully acted or staged, but they somehow coordinated their background so they look like they're in the same space. I mean, they really made an effort, and to make it look like they're kind of in the same space, like pass a cup and then the other person would get it, that kind of thing. It was really cute. And but just seeing that, I just, like what Curt was saying, you know, it was about forming a community. Again, there was no money involved or course credit, but just so that they could feel like they're one with each other. And the thing is, I found that it was a really big audience, because their friends and parents and relatives from all over the world came to watch them. So it became this kind of ironically kind of distanced and separated experience, but in a way, it's the most global experience I had. So it was a very different kind of theater experience, but one that really moved me in a very surprising way.
I love that, Esther. I feel like what I'm hearing you say is this action of connecting became so profound and became sort of the why of the theater that you were seeing online. And maybe in some ways was that act of connecting almost even more profound than in a traditional building theater setting where you have audience and artists and they're a little bit separate. So that's what I'm interpreting from what you said. And there is a question here: would you provide your understanding of online theater and what's the future of it? Curt, could I turn to you?
Well, I mean, you know, look, I'm extremely biased in this. I still want to be live and in space. Our students had the opportunity to do Carol Churchill's Skriker the other evening. There were 9 people involved in the production, and there were 6 of us in the audience. Everyone was socially distanced. Everyone was wearing masks. It was not the way that you traditionally see theater. And I left, I might actually cry now. I left crying and happy and thrilled that I could be in a room with a story again. So to Yvonne's question, the future of online theater, I mean, I think it's with us to stay now, because as Esther has said, you know, we did a production of Christmas Carol last year that was seen by over 200,000 people in over 65 countries around the world. It was very successful in the way that it knitted together this very large community. And I don't think that it will remain an impulse that we keep as a part of our work going forward, but I don't think that it can ever replace the experience of breathing the same air, of feeling your heartbeat sync up next to the person next to you. I know that it's an undeniable segment of what we're going to be doing, but I don't think it will ever replace what we're doing. As Paulina says, she misses being in the theater. And I think I do too. I think we all do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's great. When do you think we will get back to inside the theater? When is your company planning on that?
We're planning on a fall of 2021 start with the same Christmas Carol, which has been a tradition at my theater for 50 years. We do it differently every year. And so audiences from around the region come for it. We're planning that will start at the beginning of November, and that we'll start our regular season beginning in January of 2022. Those are our plans, because that's the guidance that we've been getting from health authorities. We want our audience and our artists to be safe. So that's where we are.
Mm-hmm. I see another question. I understand the cast becomes more diverse in the plays where there are no connections to very specific countries and time periods. But if we talk about Shakespeare's plays, for example, we have a deep historical background. Historical accuracy becomes too important for me. What's your opinion on whether it's worth sacrificing it or not? Oh, what an interesting question. Historical accuracy in tension with diversifying the who, maybe the body. Esther, could I turn to you first on this?
Yes, this is such an important question, and often asked by casting directors. But this also begs from whose perspective? Whose perspective is this? I think back to my graduate school years in the Midwest. I did my PhD at the Ohio State University. We were in fact producing a Chekhov play, and there was a casting call. And it was cast with all white students, and none of the non-white students are cast. And they were saying, this is how, Chekhov should look. But then if I look at these students, they are from Nebraska. They're not Russian, right? I mean, there's kind of this kind of, what we call the suspension of disbelief. Like, how much are you willing to do that? So naturalism asks you to do a suspension of disbelief in certain kinds of convention. Again, going back to the default neutral body, that we can accept as, the whites are all the same, whether they're Russia or Nebraska, whereas there's kind of this really, really strict line separating the non-whites. But then if you are willing to suspend your disbelief slightly more, then maybe you can imagine an African-American person from Ohio can be in a Chekhov play. Theater is about imagining and staging how we might see the world differently. That's what theater is. So I think the audience has really a responsibility to be willing to raise their suspension of disbelief and say, yes, I could buy into this. Once you do that, I assure you, 5 minutes into the play, you're not going to even think about that person's skin color. I mean, that's if the production is done right. So it really just is the entry point. Are you willing to make that imaginative jump? So that's something that I think we all should try to make more of.
Thanks, Esther. Curt, yeah, please.
Only because I love everything that Esther is saying. Just to respond directly to Nikita's question, and I would say, when you talk about historical accuracy, which historical accuracy are you talking about, right? Because if we saw a Shakespeare play produced in the way that Shakespeare produced it, it would be unrecognizable and unintelligible to us. There is no way to know exactly how Shakespeare produced his plays. Some of the greatest Shakespeare productions I've ever seen have been produced by Indian theaters. I'm talking about from the country of India. Those interpreters use kind of Indian communal traditions to make A Midsummer Night's Dream happen in a way that was debilitatingly beautiful. And so which historical accuracy are you talking about, right? Everyone points, when they think about how Shakespeare should be done, they tend to be talking about mid-19th century British interpretations of it. But Shakespeare is translated into almost every language that is spoken on the planet. And so each of those communities has their Shakespeare. The Shakespeare you see in Russia looks nothing like the Shakespeare that takes place in France or in Africa or in India or in Australia or the United States. We each have our own Shakespeare. Part of the brilliance of Shakespeare is the flexibility of the text to receive those bodies into them. So I'm just, the way to open up this question is to think about Shakespeare is ours now in this moment, or he's not important at all. Chekhov is ours now in this moment, or he shouldn't be done. We only have to do theater that is of the now.
That's great. Thank you. We have time for probably just one or two more questions. And I see there's a question here. Do students appreciate theater in the United States? And what do they like? What are you both finding on that? Esther, should I start with you?
Well, I think my students, I'm at Duke University, and they're very unique in that there's a huge passion for musical theater. There's a musical theater group that's been around for 50 years. So I would say that. And then also they really like horror stories for some reason. So those are two, but then, of course, a very diverse student body, but those are two that come to my mind.
Okay, horror stories. All right. Curt, what are you seeing?
I mean, just like Esther, I'm seeing that young people, particularly our high school students, love musicals. It's their gateway drug. It's their way into the theater. That's always been true. So when we've done a production of Ragtime a couple of years ago, it was a huge success. Little Shop of Horrors, huge success among our high school students. Beowulf, 1,000 Years of Baggage by Dave Malloy. It is a great show, and I encourage our Russian friends to look at that, because that was a huge hit, and it looks like a Russian musical as well with our young audiences. So musicals, always the gateway drug. My Brown University students tend to like the more politically aware work. So Brandon Jacobs Jenkins is popular. Jackie Sibley's Drury is popular. Yeah.
Excellent. I see one comment here by Paul, which I think is just beautiful. What do you think makes theater fundamentally stand out among other art media? It seems to me that whenever you go to see a play, you get immersed in this strange, dreamlike experience. And I've always felt that theater has more magic because of that. They even turn the lights down to make you feel like you're dreaming. Mm-hmm. But unlike movies, it happens in real time. So it is something that is born as the lights go out and dies as the lights go back on. So do you think there's a connection between dream and theater?
Oh, I love this question.
That's so beautiful. Yeah, Esther, please respond.
I want to go to Russia right now and have a conversation with Paul.
Yeah.
Yes. Dream it's such an important, there's a connection to theater, as Curt mentioned, Midsummer Night's Dream. Wagner. I mean, you really name it. I see theater as a collective dream. We dream together, and what we are looking for is what philosophers would call the sublime, or the moment of infinity, something that you cannot experience in real life, but you see it together, and that's the magic of theater. So yes, it's a collective dream. And what do we want to dream? What do we want to dream?
That's great.
Well, I have a play for you. It's called Sueño by Jose Rivera. Sueño is dream in Spanish. It is an adaptation of Calderón de la Barca's Spanish Golden Age play, Life is a Dream. Please read it. It's stunning,
it's
beautiful. We're producing it next season because I feel like we've all been stuck in this horrible dream of COVID for the last year. And this play is about emerging from the dream. And your question is brilliant. And so I look forward. I hope you're going to be making theater. I look forward to seeing it.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Esther. Thank you, Curt. And thank you to the students and faculty and the audience for this delightful conversation. I wish that everybody has very sweet dreams as we exit this collective Zoom. And I also invite our viewers to share your feedback with us. I'm putting a link in our chat window here, which has an evaluation form, and we would love to hear your thoughts. As you can imagine, we want to ensure that the conversations we have are relevant and important to your lives. So thank you all so much. Thank you, Curt. Thank you, Esther. Thank you, Alexander, and sweet dreams, everybody.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.